Before we jump into today's episode, a quick note about my upcoming Decode Your Food workshop on the 4th of December 2025. If you've ever felt confused about food labels, hidden sugars, or why certain foods leave you hungry, tired, or craving more, this session will change everything. You'll learn how to make sense of what you're eating, spot the traps that derail your progress, and choose food that genuinely supports your energy, hormones, and long-term health. We'll look at the clever marketing tricks behind so-called healthy foods and the red flags that reveal ultra-processed products, and the simple real food principles that help your body thrive. It's practical, it's empowering, and you'll walk away knowing exactly what to look for and what to avoid. To get more details, go to fabulouslyketo.com/workshop and then click one of the buttons for further information. Because we have listeners all over the world, there are options to pay in US dollars or British pounds, but those links will take you and give you further details. Welcome to episode 250 of the Fabulously Keto Podcast, and this week I'm talking to Professor Grant Schofield. I first met Grant at the PHC conference back in June when I heard him speak, and I knew straight away that he'd be someone you'd love to hear from. Grant has a fascinating journey from promoting low fat to becoming one of the leading voices in metabolic health. And in this conversation, he shares stories that will really make you stop and think. One moment that stood out for me was the reminder that when he described the remote Pacific Islands, where people live long, healthy lives with hardly any chronic disease until modern ultra-processed foods arrive. It's such a stark contrast and really highlights how powerfully our environment shapes our health. We also went into metabolic flexibility, brain health, glutamate, excitotoxicity, I think I said that right, fasting, sunlight, and why the easy way is often the hard way in disguise. Here's Grant's bio. Academic pioneer and health disruptor, Grant Schofield has been the Professor of Public Health at Auckland University of Technology, Director of the university's Human Potential Centre for 25 years, former Chief Scientific Officer to the Ministry of Education in New Zealand, co-author of 4 best-selling books, and Chief Science Officer for Precure. Professor Grant's career has focused on preventing the diseases of modern times and seeing what it takes to help people live long, healthy, and happy lives. He lives and breathes the motto, be the best you can be, and sees this as a game changer for the health system, capable of transforming the current health sickness model to one in which we all aspire to be well. He's redefining public health as the science of human potential, the study of what it takes to have a great life. Grant is well known for thinking outside the box and challenging conventional wisdom in nutrition and weight loss, as well as physical activity and exercise. He brings his fluency across several scientific disciplines, from human physiology to psychology to peak performance, to his role at Precure, where he delivers world-class training in lifestyle medicine. So let's dive in and go and hear from Grant. Welcome, Professor Grant, to the Fabulously Keto Podcast. It's fabulous to have you with us today.
Thanks, Jackie. Fabulous to be here.
And I'm going to ask, I always sometimes forget, but I try and remember, where in the world are you?
At the moment, I'm in New Zealand, and I'm in a small coastal town called Tairua, which in Maori, which is the native language here, stands for two tides. There's a big inner harbour in it. It's all the way in, all the way out. It's a small town of 2,000 people.
Cool. And is that where you live, or are you just visiting?
We have lived here permanently for all through COVID, and then with my youngest son at school, and then more recently, I've been working back in Auckland, and we've been coming here on weekends and holidays.
Lovely. Fabulous. So, what I'd like to know is how did you find out about low carb keto? How did you get into it and start understanding it?
Yeah, I've frankly done the exact opposite of this for most of my life. So apologies to everyone out there, and even advocated for low fat. I've always been in the field of public health, but not so much the nutrition side, but certainly partially because I was doing non-communicable disease work. And I think in about 2012, probably things came to a head. There's about three things happened all at once. I was getting back into a bit of athletics again, a bit of triathlon, in the older age groups, and I'd put on a bit of weight, and I thought, well, I'm going to get this off. And a popular diet at the time was actually a thing called the Dukan diet. I don't know if you know about Dukan, a Frenchman.
So, it's really interesting because up until 2020, I'd never heard of it. But
Yeah.
my friend Louise Reynolds, who used to co-host with me, she calls herself the larrikin. Do you have that word in New Zealand as
Yes.
well?
Yes. Yeah.
She calls herself the larrikin. She had tried the Dukan diet, and I said, "What is that? I've never heard of it." So yeah, go ahead and tell people because I don't think it's that popular here in the UK.
Well, it's actually not a great diet because it's sort of the rabbit starvation version of what we now know as keto, I suppose. So it's high protein, some intermittent fasting, but low fat and no carbohydrates, which is pretty brutal. And in the sort of Stephenson, the early Arctic explorers, that's what they described as rabbit starvation. High protein without the fat can be pretty brutal. But it's weird how I was attracted to that. It was actually around the time of Kate Middleton's wedding, and her sister had lost all this weight to be part of the wedding, and they were calling her Her Royal Hotness at that stage, which will appeal to the English. Not that I was going for that, but I just had heard of it. So I was doing that, and it's actually very effective at getting you into ketosis, I suppose. At the same time, I'd been doing work in our lab, and we have both athletes and type 2 diabetics coming through a metabolic laboratory. And I just remembered the VO2 testing, the respiratory testing, where you put the mask on and you're expiring oxygen and carbon dioxide. And one of the great measures of that is understanding fat versus carbohydrate metabolism. And you notice that the athletes that struggled over the longer distances and all of the type 2 diabetics were what we would call metabolically inflexible. And then another colleague of mine, Tim Noakes, was just coming out, I suppose, is what it used to be called in that time, of, in a similar field to mine, going, hey, I got all this stuff wrong. And in fact, you can become metabolically flexible by, going on low carb keto diets. And so that was really interesting. But at the same time, the most interesting piece of work I had done, I had a German PhD student, Katja Zefkin, and these Germans, they go on these, I don't know, internships that seem to go on and on and on until their mid to late 20s. And she had done her degree and then her master's, and she'd done internships with the World Health Organization here, there, and everywhere. But she'd ended up in the South Pacific in Fiji, and they really liked her, and they were started to give us contracts they'd pay us. This is like a academic's dream come true. You'd go to these remote Pacific islands and you'd do work around diabetes and other metabolic disease prevention. And the remote Pacific is so interesting because it's, I suppose, in the Charles Dickens sense, the best of times, the worst of times there.
Yeah,
And the best of times is where they're still living in the way they much have. And there's really no trace of chronic disease.
yeah.
There's no diabetes, there's really no cancer, there's no heart disease. And the average life expectancy is in the mid 70s. And you observe this idiopathic death. It's so interesting that almost everyone who gets to old age, which is most people, seems to be quite happily working in the community, and then just eventually they become a bit infirm for a week or two, and that's the end of their life. So they live long and
Drop
drop
dead.
dead.
That's my goal.
It's just, yeah, which is great. We're all aspiring for that, right? That's what we should be aspiring for.
Yeah.
And you look at their diet, and it doesn't resemble this was work funded by the World Health Organization, so you can imagine the state of their guidelines. It has nothing much to do with low fat, whole grains. And actually it's, because they relies on coconut products and animal products, and then the sort of seasonal fruits and vegetables, it's a pretty low carbohydrate diet. So that's the best of times. The worst of times is as soon as you go from any of these remote islands to where it's become urbanized. We were in this particular island I'm thinking of is in Vanuatu, but you go back to Port Vila, the capital of Vanuatu, or Nandi or Suva in Fiji, or Nuku'alofa in Tonga. Then these are amongst the fattest countries in the world. They have the most diabetes, and the worst of all places is actually an island called the island's called Tarawa, but it's of an island group called Kiribati. So Kiribati used to be called the Gilbert and something other islands until they renamed it. But it's just in the North Pacific, just on the equator, and it doesn't get seasonal cyclones, so you can live on these low-lying coral atolls. And probably most well known for the Japanese and the Americans, going at it at World War II and decimated the local population, which was then probably 2,000. Now it's 40,000. And so you've got a coral atoll, a couple of meters above sea level, 200 meters wide, 40 kilometers long. You've got 40,000 people there and no local food supply. They've sold the fishing rights off to the Chinese, and they're on 2-minute noodles and fizzy drinks.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it because of the ultra processed foods that they're consuming?
Yeah, you go in there and you start doing random glucose blood tests and HbA1cs and things, and 50% of the adult population has type 2 diabetes. To put in context what that means medically speaking, the local hospital is cutting off, between I suppose 12 and 20 limbs a month through the complications of type 2 diabetes. It's absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
And you sort of suddenly go, well, should I tell you to eat more whole grains and go low fat and do what the WHO says, or should we go and eat actually more like what these guys over in Vanuatu are eating, and presumably what you're eating up until just recently? And I mean, it's just perverse to go into a country like that with, these current guidelines still are there today, a decade and a half after they've gone. So those all things came together, and then we just said, like, we've got to start trying this and doing our own trials. And that's been the main focus of our research ever since. I had a PhD student, a dietitian called Karen Zinn, who's now actually Professor Karen Zinn, and really top professor in nutrition, who then helped us author a few of these books. We wrote 6 books in the end, but with I think the title sold them, so we called them What the Fat, and that WTF sort of question mark logo really took off. So that was sort of the original low carb. It was called low carb health, high fat, then low carb healthy fat back then, which seems to have disappeared. But that was really the brand that put us on the map, and then got the research going over the next decade or two.
Yeah. So with the islanders, are they struggling much more? I heard this, and I don't know if it was Chris Van Tulleken's book, Ultra Processed People, in that they are suffering more because they've been exposed to the high carbohydrate, ultra processed food a lot less than we have in, say, the Western world.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we've studied this a little bit with a gene variant called AMI1, which codes for, you have a copy number variant of this, and it codes for salivary amylase. And so people with high copy numbers of this tend to be people, phenotypes that have had starch in their society for a while, Japanese or those types of Asian groups, us a little bit in that European one, but Pacific in particular seem to be quite low in that copy number. So they haven't been exposed to sugar and starch, and that has a profound effect on things. So when you're high in that copy number, you start to produce insulin when starch hits the mouth. And so you're more insulin sensitive. When you don't have that, which they don't, then you have to wait for it to get to the bloodstream, and you have a much more exacerbated glucose and insulin response. So that's one thing. But the question is, why is that? And I suppose my view on that, this is a sort of anthropological speculation, which I have really no business doing. But I suppose my observation there is the problem on remote Pacific Islands is one of food security, and it's related to seasonal cyclones. And so you'll have a complete devastation of the local food supply that they're growing, and then you'll also, all the fish leave the reef in time of a cyclone. So I imagine You want to be pretty good at storing food as extra fat when it's
Yeah.
available.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's my observation. I don't know how you prove that or not.
No, well, we don't know, do we? So
Yeah.
you just come up with some hypothesis and work
Yeah.
around that until you've proved otherwise, I guess.
Mm.
The problem is with our metabolic health is the things that are proved otherwise are not being taken into account and added into our lifestyles for
Mm.
most people. I mean, we do it, but a lot of people still are on the old paradigms that don't work.
Mm.
So, what is your special interest? So, you've been a public health person in the university. What is your particular interest?
Well, I think for me, I'm like a career sort of scientist and researcher, mainly academic, bit of a practitioner. I guess my interests have followed my life course. When I was quite young, I was really interested in sport and exercise science because that's what I was doing myself.
I think I think
Then I was really,
you're quite an athlete, weren't you? Or are
oh,
you
well, I wouldn't go,
still?
oh, no, I'm certainly not still. I aspire to be fit, of course, especially metabolically, but I was interested in that. Then you have a young family, so you're interested in that age group and then the next one and the next one and the next one, and you sort of keep those things going. I suppose what I want to call myself now is a psychophysiologist. I'm interested in physiology and a big biological lens on what makes us human. So, including, of course, that is a big bit of metabolism and the work we've done and still do and what we eat. And I've followed that one, I think, to quite a lot of ends, working in government trying to change food and nutrition policy, which I think was eventually futile. Writing popular books, conducting research in that area. I would say I probably, although I'm still doing quite a lot of that, um, after a couple of decades of doing trials and showing things, we discovered, Karenson and I, that we were doing, there was actually an academic discipline for some of the other stuff we enjoyed more, which is called implementation science. And that's taking, no one's scientific results. For example, eating less glucose. This makes us sound relatively stupid, actually. Eating less glucose puts glucose in your blood up less in the first place, and therefore you'll have better glucose control. And eventually, if you do that well enough, you might not be a diabetic anymore, and you'll avoid all the metabolic complications. Therefore, almost all chronic diseases.
Yeah.
That seems like a first principles and well-known scientific fact. Epidemiologically, experimentally, but getting a health system to actually understand that, uptake it, and use that knowledge, it turns out, as I think and most of your listeners will know, seems to be quite another thing
Yeah.
altogether. Like how, and so I think that's what I've been most attracted to in recent times is how to infiltrate those health systems. That's why we've got on with the idea of health coaching, because they're not indoctrinated already or, think they know everything. And I think health coaching is a really great way to, work on the behavioral side as well as learn the scientific aspects as well.
Yeah. I
Mm.
definitely agree, but there's just something around well, we want to call them health systems, but I sort of think of them as sickness systems, that then they're not interested in us being healthy. There is a
Yeah,
complete
yeah.
lack of interest to shift, and we know it's a lot of it is financial, but it just seems like we're forever pushing this rock up the mountain.
I mean, we would go, and at one particular time sticks in my mind. We went to one of the local big hospitals. Really high proportion of type 2 diabetes. They have these things called grand rounds. In other words, you do presentations to the specialists. We end up doing some with endocrinology, and we're showing low carb results. But one result came out a few years ago. It's a meta-analysis of randomized trials in diet and diabetes outcomes. So they've taken all diet trials in diabetes, and looked at the carbohydrate composition of what they're presented with, and they've looked at how that affects HbA1c, amongst other things. And you just see the straight line heading straight down. The more you restrict carbohydrate, the more effective that diabetic diet is at resolving your blood sugar levels. At the far Then you've got keto, and then you just work your way back from there, and eventually you get to the guidelines, which hardly does anything. Um, and you show this to this group. Remember, this is a medical specialty that only really does stuff to do with mainly diabetes,
Yeah.
and they just can't understand it. And then someone will stand up literally in a bow tie and with the full medical accent go, yes, well, I'd like to see long-term data on that. And you just go, oh, for God's sake, it's a meta-analysis of randomized trials. Hey, my camera has just actually stopped working.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's going to
You
come
have
right.
frozen.
Yeah, hopefully that comes right. It will. So that's what you're dealing with in medicine is a sort of snobbery and bamboozlement at changing your mind. And honestly, that's just an astonishing fact of medicine. And so the question is, you're probably not going to change more than a few people's minds. So how else are you going to infiltrate the system? And don't underestimate the public's role in public health. And this is why what you do is so important. This is why everyone who listens to this is so important, is that, eventually policy change only comes after, everyone's been doing it for ages anyway. So that's where I've got to in the decades I've been doing this.
Yeah. I agree that it never comes from the top down. It's always from the ground up, that we have to be the change, and then it infiltrates. And everyone will say, oh yeah, but we always knew that. But they weren't listening 10 years ago.
No.
So with Precure, you're now training health coaches, is that right?
Yeah, so we started a organization called Precure with a K, which stands for Prevention is Cure, which sort of, well, it's what we stand for, me and 12 other health professionals, probably in 2018. And then, actually, I think the UK has been doing all right on this. New Zealand's been doing okay, and hopefully we could lead the world a bit. But yeah, our primary care system is, more or less collapsing because we have an aging general practice workforce, both doctors and practice nursing. And the question is, how do you get a functioning system that doesn't just give out pills and prescriptions on 10-minute appointments? And we think that health coaching workforce can work really well, and we've done quite a bit of work in doing that, and have a lot of general practices where that's a functioning model, where it's lifestyle medicine first, it's diet first, it's here's your choice, metabolic medicines which are mainly futile, or lifestyle changes, and we can measure those. And of course, we see similar results to what you see, say in David and Unwin's practice in the UK, or anywhere else where they're practicing that type of model. It's just a highly effective
Yeah.
outcome.
So here in the UK, there are lots of GP practices have health coaches. I just
Mm.
suspect that most of the health coaches are going to be trained around the standard Western diet practice,
Yeah, well, yeah,
rather than a metabolic health practice.
yeah. Come to Precure. In fact, there's a Scotsman in the UK at the moment who's done the Met-Sci, Ellie,
Oh
who's doing
yeah,
the metabolic
Ali.
health.
Yeah.
Yeah, we trained Ellie up on for exactly that reason at Precure, because I think he did such, that's his place he wanted to go. He knew what he wanted to do and be accredited in, and that's what we do.
So I was going to ask you, do you do it virtually as well as in
Yeah,
person,
yeah,
or
well,
just virtually?
yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. So the labs are live, but like we're doing now on Zoom for all the coaching practice, and then the courses are asynchronous. So yeah, I think that's probably a reasonable way to go. Especially, I'm going to be a professor at a university for my whole life, and the sort of demise of the modern university is just absolutely well known to most people, I think, at the moment. The lack of critical thinking, the lack of the university is a place you would come for an argument. Uh, Even in the Monty Python sense, it would be a good place to come for an argument, but it's just, completely absent from the system now. And, the all of our main dietetic schools here in New Zealand, and all of our medical schools, if they teach anything, it's the dietary guidelines still.
Yeah.
In this day and age, it's an appalling situation.
Yeah. I call it criminal. It's almost criminal that
Mm.
we know there's enough of us out there that know that you can affect change, and yet they are not telling people about it.
There's still a problem, Jackie, I think, with saturated fat for most of them. For most of the health professionals I work with, it's still a huge stumbling block to get over. That and, more recently, probably red meat, although, which I both of, I regard butter and meat as health foods, to be honest.
Yeah.
That's just not the prevailing view. And there's some view, especially about nutrients that need to be obtained from, special vegetables, and no discussion of the nutrient density of fresh animal products, which, are the most nutritious things in the world.
Yeah.
That seems to be something that's absent from their line of thinking.
And I think that's our biggest challenge is getting, the public to change their opinion on red meat, particularly, and fat, butter and
Mm.
animal
Mm.
fat. They get it with the salmon. They can go there with the
Yeah.
salmon, but they don't translate that across to animals, on land animals. And I am always coming up against that. Oh yes, lean meat, lean white meat. It's like, really?
Yeah. Well, I suppose we can blame the Adventists for a lot of that with that whole movement, going back to Kellogg and then Alan White before that, and everything that's come from that. I'm sure most people are familiar with that
Yeah,
story.
yeah.
Mm.
We've had Belinda Fitke on a long time
Oh
ago.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
Belinda will tell a much deeper story than I ever will, so I'll let her do that. Yeah.
So tell us a bit about the mental health aspect of, you know, low carb versus high carb and how that affects the brain and our well-being.
Well, I've really got involved in that, and part of the reason I don't know people realize my original health professional training as a psychologist. I'm actually not very good in the sense that, what a good psychologist does is the opposite of a research scientist, which is shut up and listen and help people find their own solutions, which is good for training health coaches as well. But I just suck at that. I want to go and find out the answer, and I'll just go a little bit of history on this. So the very first ever study I did with a graduate student, my first ever master's student, when I had a job in a psychology department in Australia, had nothing to do with diet actually, but it's sort of close to what we're thinking about with modern metabolism. Is that this young woman had a 6-year-old son. He was in year one of school in Australia, and 5 or 6 boys in that class were. This was in the mid-90s. Were medicated with dexamphetamine, Ritalin, to control their ADHD diagnosis. And somehow we got ethics to take all the boys off their medicines, and they would go out every hour or so on a trampoline in pairs. I don't know if you have a thing in the UK called a pool noodle, but it's just a big, spongy thing you can beat the crap out of someone else with.
The
Um,
the long tubes, the foam
yeah,
tubes.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah, yeah. So they would have one of those each, and they'd just go at it for 5 minutes every hour, and they no longer needed their ADHD medicines, which is really interesting about the sort of, you know, metabolic and nervous system stimulation angles of human behavior. So that was my sort of first entry into that, and I forgot about it for a while and did some other things. And then, got into this whole low carb keto stuff, and, mainly focusing on diabetes because it's obviously the easiest win. But in more recent times, especially when you work at a university, like this whole mental health thing is really a big deal, at least in our country it is. So there's interesting data. About 5% of our 16 to 24-year-olds suffer at any one time severe psychological distress. At least they did in the early 2000s. And it's not mental illness, but they just don't function very well in society.
Yeah,
And that was tootling along. And then same in the UK and, all of the English speaking countries. And about
yeah.
2012, it started tilting way up, and it's just rocketed up ever since. And, the question is, what factors are there? So I think there's multiple factors. I don't just pick on diet, but, inactivity, poor metabolism, and poor diet are certainly part of that. Nutrient insufficiency is. I work with another professor here in New Zealand, Julia Ruckledge, who does high dose micronutrients around mental health. But I think, more recently, the sort of work by Chris Palmer to bring it to popular attention, and then, a whole bunch of other people have made us understand that if you're talking about metabolism and sort of having anti-inflammatory processes, not other just being caught in a pro-inflammatory state the whole time, if it was going to have an effect anywhere, it'd be in the most metabolically active organ in the body, which is the brain. And that's become really interesting to me. I like to get into the mechanisms of this as well. And I think one of the problems in brain research is that the serotonin view of depression was just wrong. It's not the cause, and this is why SSRIs are so ineffective,
Yeah.
and plausibly harmful. But actually, I think there is some other things, and I think keto fits into this really well. And I think it's around the neurotransmitter glutamate. And people don't hear much about glutamate, which is so interesting to me because glutamate's your excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's sort of leveled off by an inhibitory one called GABA. And they work together to run most of the processes in the brain. Those together make up 90% of our neurotransmitters. The other one is dopamine, serotonin, and the like, more modulatory. They're not excitatory or inhibitory in the way that these are. So, you expect them to be involved in some way.
Yeah.
And now what we see with glutamate is it can be over-secreted, and it can be over-secreted for, a bunch of different reasons. But one's just too much stress. They don't get mopped up in the next place, which is too much inflammation and so on. The problem with this glutamate is when it's overexpressed and it's not mopped up, it seeps out into general space outside of the synaptic cleft into just general space in the brain, and it's toxic, and that's called glutamate excitotoxicity. And the problem with that is that it kills brain cells, and that wouldn't be that bad, but it's a downward spiral. So because a living cell has 12,000 times more glutamate inside it than outside of it, when that brain cell dies, that's spilt out into more space, and you get a downward spiral. And most people will know this from, I think, traumatic brain injury or concussion. You get some initial damage to some brain cells from an impact, and that's not that great. But over time, the damage actually gets worse. That's the worsening of the concussion symptoms, and it's because of the downward spiral of glutamate excitotoxicity. And there's other reasons. It's Alzheimer's, same thing. You start to get brain cells dying for other reasons, but then they cause downward spiral. Too much stress. But this high amounts of inflammation is a real issue. And glucose burning as the primary and only fuel source in the brain is pro-inflammatory. To get the brain into a catabolic anti-inflammatory state, you more or less do need ketones produced.
Yeah.
And I think that's a key mechanism around having ketones present, a ketogenic diet. There's a whole bunch of other factors here, calming through breathing, cold therapy, extra magnesium. There's a whole, I've written a whole white paper on this. If people just Google up, Grant Schofield excitotoxicity, you'll find it.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really plausible way to think about a more holistic way of why the brain comes together and why ketogenic diets are important. The brain needs to be in an anti-inflammatory state, and that's going to require the presence of ketones. And you can get those by eating, moderate to lowish carb, but you'd have to exercise a fair bit, which humans have historically, or just have food not turn up every now and again, which also historically has been a thing. But in the modern environment, you've got junk food turning up ubiquitously, no breaks in that. You're not moving, and there's just a fair bit going on. And just to there's probably another layer on this that's not metabolic, which is to do with the influence of social media and the dopamine type pathways as well, which I don't think's helped either.
Yeah. So earlier you said about 2012, mental health getting worse. And I was thinking, okay, so what happened between the early 2000s and 2012? And then my thought was social media.
Yeah, so
That's where it
that's
started to
certainly
take off and be ubiquitous.
that's certainly Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which I know many people would have looked at, and Jean Twenge, the psychologist of San Diego, would say that's the main culprit. And I do think disruption of the reward system is part of that, but the junk food high carb environment also disrupts the exact same reward system and is, I think, implicated as part of that as well. So does vaping, so does gaming, so does porn. So, food's not the only factor, but it certainly needs to be part of the solution.
Yeah. Well, definitely needs to be part of the solution. And I
Mm.
think, once you start down this road of I'm looking after my health and I'm taking responsibility for my health, then you start to look, you might start with the diet, but you start to look at other areas. What am I doing with my time? Am I sleeping well enough? Am I getting my sleep hygiene and turning stuff off before I go to bed? And all these things start to take place. And so then the other things start to fall away, I guess.
Yeah, it's an interesting one as well because, I mean, the nutrition guidelines are just, rubbish all round. So that they need to be completely revamped. But most of the other ones have some semblance of reality, the physical activity guidelines or, things to be sleep, but then they're not based in any way, shape, or form of optimizing your health. They're about the sort of minimum amount you do not to be at the lowest, form of humanity. So, the 30 minutes a day of, well, gardening counts, or you just move around and you'll be healthy is sort of true. It's better than not moving at all and being, completely on the couch. But it has nothing to do with optimizing your health. So, I think once most of your listeners, once they've gone down the keto journey, we're going to start to engage in, the rest of the optimization around having a good life. I mean, frankly, I've always been of the view, if you're going to be alive, you might as well be having a good time of it.
Yeah.
What's a good time? Well, it's not hedonism. That anyone who's tried just doing nothing and guzzling themselves after a while gets sick of that. It's having a meaningful life. Well, what do you need to have a meaningful life? You need to be healthy so you can actually go after it.
Yes.
So you might as well be healthy. Well, it's compulsory. If you're going to have a good life, you have to be healthy. And to be healthy, you're going to have to learn something about optimizing rather than just meeting the bare minimum.
Yeah.
And
So
that's where we're at.
in terms of exercise, what would you say to people for optimizing their health?
Well, I think this particularly applies as you age. You're going to have to maintain some muscle mass. In days gone by, you go down the farm and do some farm work, some ploughing or some digging or carrying some animals around. Most of us aren't going to have access to that side of things, so you're actually going to have to go and manufacture this by doing some resistance training or the like. So for me, I do that a couple of times a week, 40 minutes at a time or so. But until I fail, like there's some stress involved there.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have to have cardiorespiratory fitness. You're going to have to move, and you're going to have to do a fair bit of it. Humans have moved many hours in a day. That's what I've done, and I sort of feel the the thing for me. You talk to people, and we've done this sort of research for years. I haven't got time to cook, haven't got time to exercise, and then you look at their time use data, which we're fond of doing. And you go, well, you're on a device 5 hours a day. Um, and, no wonder.
Yeah.
So, I think time's the issue. In fact, if you'll just indulge me, I've just today tried to, I don't know if people will be into this, but in 1923, an Englishman, Aldous Huxley, wrote a 1,000 word essay called Pleasures and predicted that Orwell's 1984 wasn't going to turn out. It wasn't going to be about the thought police, but we'd be so mired in our own pleasures. He talks about soaking in a tepidity of nonsense that you wouldn't need any thought control. People would just be sick and useless because of this reliance on non-participation. And he was lamenting the fact that English men and women would no longer go to a funeral or a wedding and engage actively in a debate. Uh, the country folk would put on a show and everyone would be involved. So he was just thinking about silent movies and just generally going to a wedding and watching. He had never heard of Netflix or junk food or Doritos,
Yeah.
and so I think Huxley was more or less right. But I've been trying to write today. I'm wondering if I could rewrite a modern day version of Huxley's work, especially with the idea of there's a 1992 idea of a thing called non-places, which is things like airports and cars and service, petrol stations and these things. They're places, but nothing actually happens there. You don't live there. They're sterile. There's no life to be had on the M1 or the Auckland or the motorway or wherever you happen to be around the world.
Yeah.
But I've been trying to translate into those places are not just physical anymore. They're also mental. Scrolling on Instagram is a non-place.
Yes.
Um, Time's just slipping away from you.
You
And
just think, well, I've really cut back on my social media. I hardly go on at all now. But if I do, because I've got a Facebook group, but so sometimes I go in and I'll post something, but then you get caught in it. And if 10, 15 minutes for me is like a long time, but for others, it was be going on and on and on. It used to be like that for me as well. You just sit there and an hour's gone.
well, I was talking to a teenage girl just the other day, and she said, "Oh, I had a really bad night's sleep." I said, "Well, what happened?" She said, "Oh, I got on TikTok and it was 10 o'clock at night, and before I knew it, it was 3 in the morning." That's an astonishing thing, isn't it?
It is,
Uh,
it's really bad.
hmm.
So Ado Huxley, it's his
Idolus.
his pleasures and 1984 seem to have combined together to be 2020 to 2025.
Well, I suppose that's true if you take into account COVID and those sorts of totalitarianism rearing their head. But yeah, true.
Yeah, yeah, not good. We need to change stuff up, I think. So, is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that we haven't spoken about today?
I guess the other things that I think about, sort of lost my way in psychology and the behavioral side of having a good life, and especially diet and eating. There's actually quite a lot of interesting stuff happening there. I just finished writing a book, actually, a couple of books, but one for my students about I sort of look at psychology and go, well, you're a cognitive behavioral practitioner, you're an acceptance commitment practitioner, you're people do this non-violent communication, which I renamed, or you do this, that, and the other thing. Why don't we just make all those tools available to people? So I've been working really hard on that. That all of these tools in psychology have, um, you know, one's a good screwdriver, one's a good hammer, one's a good saw. Building a house, you need these, and I'm sort of disappointed in psychology for missing that. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and that's cool.
Do you think that's
Uh,
part of the medical model of siloing everything into different
oh yeah, yeah,
pieces?
yeah,
So
100%. Even when you do behavioral stuff, you finally get around to it. You only do this much of it. This little. But all of those tools, especially one of the psychological ones called acceptance commitment therapy, these are simple tools. Anyone can learn them, and they're good fun. They change your life for the better. They're not psychobabble mumble jumble that's stuck up in some ivory tower somewhere. So if you're interested in psychology and behavior change and having a good life, then do your own research on that. They're cool, especially the acceptance commitment stuff. I love this. I never learned it. I did 9 years of psychology, never heard of it. And it's good stuff. And the other thing, I just finished a book that I've called Choose Your Hard. Um, Actually, this might not be appropriate language, but I, I said, my 85-year-old mother said, "Grant, I don't know about the title for that book." She said, "I feel it's a little bit sexual." And I was like, "Oh my God." I hadn't even thought of that. But thanks, Mum. But the idea was there that I suppose what a lot of what we've talked about tonight is that whatever path you take in life, there's going to be work involved. It's hard. It's hard to get your diet organized and eat properly.
yeah.
Equally, it's hard to have a chronic disease from not eating properly. There's no path in life that is easy. They're all hard. But I think coming to terms with that reality allows us to actually make these healthy choices. I sort of talk about the essential elements of a good life. Food is medicine, fitness is medicine, sleep is medicine, light is medicine, breathing is medicine, changing the temperature is medicine. These are the essential elements for having a good life, and all of them require some hard work up front. The hard way is the easy way, and the easy way is the hard way. There's many ways around of putting that.
Yeah. And I used to say that I used to think that I was lazy and because I didn't do stuff or I didn't want to do stuff.
Mm.
And then I'd say, but I create myself more work doing that. Trying to be lazy creates more work in and of itself.
Yeah,
And but
yeah.
now I realize that it wasn't that at all. It was all food, mostly food related, that my just brain just didn't want to do stuff. And when you clean up your diet, you sort of free up your brain as well to do stuff.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point, and that because that almost contradicts everything I've just been saying about psychology, but I think it's an important contradiction that's true, is that uh, sometimes we go for behavioral solutions, especially in poor mental health, when there's just an easy biological one. We overestimate the power of psychology and we underestimate the power of biology. Food addictions are an absolute classic. Controlling your glucose and insulin are absolute classics for that. They're just the solution is biological. It's powerful, and it turns out you weren't weak-willed and useless, and all of the other things that people have judged you on and you've judged yourself on. I'm not referring to you specifically. I'm
Yeah,
saying
no, but it's
probably.
true. Yeah, and it is that is exactly where I was.
Yeah, uh, yeah, yeah. So that's a good point you raised with that. I think actually
Yeah.
that's true as well.
And the other thing that you said, it's hard in the beginning, but I just think it's hard all the time. We have to work at stuff all the time, no matter how long. So you've been in this world for maybe 15 years or something like that.
Mm,
I've been low carb keto for 8 years. It's still a
mm.
challenge. It does get easier in a way in that it's easy to flip backwards and forwards. I loved your that you said that you're offline. You said that you're low carb with lapses. I mean, that's definitely me. I'd say low carb keto with lots of lapses, but it is easier to get back, but it's still challenging all the time when someone says, "Do you want an ice cream when it's really hot?" or "Would you like some birthday cake?" or whatever it is. It's still hard.
Yeah, I mean we're hardwired for this to like sweet stuff. It's a basic fact of the matter. We can do something a bit about it, but yeah, I agree. I say low carb with lapses. Yeah, I mean, people criticize me because I like to do challenges, right? So I like to do like self experiments and 3 week challenges. I'm strict keto at the moment, and then on Monday, we did every year, first Monday in July, we do a 5 day fast. So I'm going to do that. People go, oh, well, that's a bit extreme, and then I'll probably lapse back over the rest of July, frankly. And by the start of August, I'll probably be ready to go and do another challenge that's pretty strict for 2 or 3 weeks. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's what works in my life.
Yeah.
Is coming and going from strictness and then easing off. I'm not. I don't know. My willpower is good. My won't power sucks. And I talk to people. A lot of diet talks, and people are like, oh well, I have a little dark chocolate in the cupboard, and we just eat a square a night. I mean, it's just not even a plausible thing for me. I'll just eat the whole thing. I'm just hopeless. And so, I don't know what I'm going to do about that. But I've got my ways of just going hard and then easing off, going hard and easing off, and that's
Yeah.
what works for me.
And yeah, and everybody's different because there are people that, like you said, the one square becomes the whole bar, but then it spirals down into much worse stuff and they can't
Mm,
get back. So
mm,
you seem to be able to pull yourself back.
I
And
do.
and I can, and I say I'm a moderator. I'm the one square person that could just have one square. But so we're all different and we all need to find our own way and see what works for us. So when's your book coming out? I quite like the sound of that book.
Oh yeah, the Choose Your Heart. It's good. So I had written it. It was 80,000 words, and my wife and then editor looked at it and was like, "Oh, that's ridiculous. It needs to be 50,000." Of course, that just devastates you. And so I'm hoping to have it out by September. 3 months from when we record this. That's going to be September, end of September, 2025. So it'll be on my website. So
Perfect. So tell people about your website, how they can connect with you, how they can find Precure, all these things.
yeah, so profgrantschofield.com is my personal site. It's got all my stuff on there. You can contact me from there. Then precure.com is our health coaching, metabolic health coaching, mental health coaching pathway, PRE, and then with a K, KURE.com, Precure.
And social media?
Oh, yeah, I've got all sorts of random ones there, but I sort of use them for different things. So, I'm trying to build up the old LinkedIn, so it's just under Prof. Grant Schofield on LinkedIn and write sensible articles there. And then on Facebook, Prof. Grant Schofield as well. Those are pretty much the same articles. X, Twitter, I quite like actually. It's trained, the algorithm for me is to pop up all my research and lifestyle and keto and metabolic stuff. So that's at Grant SNZ. I didn't have any keto when I started that whole Twitter then experiment. But people say they don't like Twitter. I actually really like it for, just briefly writing bits and pieces. So it's pretty unstructured. And I do have a Prof. Grant Schofield on Instagram, but I haven't really, Instagram's deadly for me because I go down there and I start scrolling and I get stuck. Mainly, I don't know why, and it's mainly English clips of people clipping their hedges and cleaning up really overgrown English yards. I don't know why it's got me on the algorithm for that, but that's I get stuck there. So I don't know. Maybe I like those.
Yeah. Mine is normally skiing stuff, people doing stuff on snow.
Okay, well there you go. Then I've never been served that. It's just hedges and overgrown lawns.
You must have been doing something with your backyard.
Yeah, exactly.
So before we finish, would you tell everyone your three top tips for I don't know, keto, good life, brain health, anything you like?
I think tip one is I think not eating, having periods where you don't eat is important. Whether those are built into a bit of intermittent fasting, at least for part of your week, a longer fast, once or twice a year. I think not eating makes you metabolically flexible. It brings everything back really quickly and clears the mind. I don't have any evidence for this, but I believe it really helps regenerate the immune system. I think that's an important part. So I think that's the first thing.
When I was just going to interrupt you, when you do your 5 day fast next week,
Mhm.
would
Yep.
that be water and salt only, or
We've decided we're doing black coffee because that's a deal breaker for us. Um, I'm interesting. I would normally just do salt. We have this time we've bought these little packets of those elemental type electrolytes with more electrolytes in them. I'm going to try them. I mean, they're super yummy, but I'm a bit worried they're a bit sweet and they, might just ruin the whole thing. But I'll let you know about that one. So
yeah.
that's what I do. What about you? Do
So
you?
I tend to do a 3 day fast
Yeah.
in the equinoxes, so
Oh
the
yeah,
March and September.
yeah.
And more recently, I have included tea with my 3 teaspoons of milk, a
Okay.
couple of cups a day. I really need to get back to doing just water. And I did buy some electrolytes recently, and I really disliked them and I gave them away. I spent about £50 sterling on electrolytes because buy one, get one half price, whatever it was. So it ended up being something like £50 and I could not tolerate it. I just gave it away. So I just do salt and magnesium.
Yeah, right. Well, were they too sweet, or you just didn't like the taste, or?
Didn't like the taste. It had a really weird taste. I think I chose
Okay.
the one that wasn't sweet, and
Yeah,
actually it was pretty gross. So I didn't.
yeah,
I make my own salt capsules. I buy magnesium. I take loads of magnesium, and if I'm fasting, I probably up it a little bit as well. So
yeah,
yeah, that's my
yeah.
fast.
So it's okay. So tip two.
Yeah.
You might be surprised at this one because I have said nothing about supplements and I've been anti-supplements my whole life. But to be honest, if you look at the data and your own personal risk, I reckon using creatine is a goer for brain health, for sleep, for cognitive functioning, for fitness gains. I'm all for it. And I think it's actually a pretty miracle supplement. Even used in a randomized trial recently with depression, uh, sort of doubled the effectiveness of talk therapies, which were reasonably effective in the first place. So, like an astonishing effect size. Yeah, more work coming there. So that's number two. And the third one, let's do a non-food or supplement one. Getting outside every day in actual sunlight is Like there's no, this whole discovery that, especially infrared light penetrates centimeters into the skin, into the cells, into the mitochondria, into the electron transport chain is an amazing thing. That's something that comes from billions of kilometers away with no mass and no charge, moves electrons in your energy producing components of your cell and changes your metabolic health is an amazing discovery. Like,
Yeah.
I just
So,
can't wait to learn more and more about that as the scientists who do that stuff do it.
yeah. So
Yeah.
on that note, how long, what would you say is minimum and what's optimal? And then my other question on that, so I'm just going to roll them up in one because you can probably cover it all, is like you're in your midwinter now. You've just gone past your
Mm-hmm.
midwinter. What do you do when you're in an environment which is cold in the winter and you don't want to be stripping off in the winter? What are you doing now in winter?
Yeah, I'm doing more saunas than I have done just because it's something to do. But I did write a social media post about this last week, lamenting the grey and darkness and the New Zealand winter and the rain and the cold. Interestingly, a couple of colleagues, Aussies who have lived in the UK now for 25 years, commented and said, "You've got no idea. You don't live in the UK." And I was like, well, fair enough, you're in summer. But if you can afford it and you live in a UK or New Zealand type or European dark winter, go somewhere for a week or even a few days twice during that winter. We have already booked going to a place called Malulabar near Noosa on Australia's Sunshine Coast, which is just, a real absolute paradise for us Kiwis to get more vitamin D. If you can take advantage of modern technology and get out of the dark winter, even for a brief time. I mean, in a single hour sun exposure of decent sun, not weak, insipid UK or New Zealand sun, you can produce 20,000 IUs of vitamin D in just an hour. So, that's an astonishingly powerful effect.
Yeah, brilliant. Grant, thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you, Grant, for such an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. I loved the mix of research, real-world stories, and practical wisdom. There's plenty in this episode for us all to reflect on, whether it's taking breaks from eating, getting outside more often, or simply understanding our health from a bigger picture perspective. If you'd like to connect with Grant or explore his work, all the links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Disclaimer. The content of this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Our guests, whether healthcare professionals or not, are sharing their personal opinions and experiences. This does not establish a doctor-patient relationship. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making changes to your medications, treatment, or lifestyle, particularly if you're on medication or have concerns about your health.